And today's reading is a unique one in that it only happens every few years. It's the 53rd reading in the book, and that doesn't happen every year. It's called the Last Commandment. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. Jesus Christ, near the end of the Gospel according to St. John, gave as his last commandment that we love one another. In John 13:34 and 35, he said, "A new commandment I give unto you, that ye shall love one another as I have loved you, that ye also love one another. By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples." Again, in John 15:12, he said, "This is my commandment, that ye love one another as I have loved you." How did he love us? Personally, yes, in the sense that he loved and forever loves each one of us for who we are, and not abstractly, but impersonally also, in the sense that the Christ, the divine consciousness, is not conscious of itself as separate from us. He loves us not only for, but as our very self. His love is a manifestation of infinity, loving us as expressions of infinity. He does not see us as we see ourselves. He forever sees us in our divine potential. Paramahansa Yogananda made a very similar statement to the monks very shortly before his own departure from his body. "Respect one another as I respect you." His use of the word respect instead of love was deliberate. He wanted to emphasize for them the importance of impersonal love and friendship from God, for God. Worldly people do not understand that in impersonal love there is much deeper love than exists in personal love. Impersonal love is expansive, not contractive. One day, the master was going for an outing, and the monks were helping him to his car. Yogananda had been having difficulty with his knees. He remarked, "You are all so kind to me with your many attentions." "Oh, sir," they replied, "it is your kindness to which we respond." The master smiled sweetly. "God is helping God," he said. "That is his drama." The second commandment Jesus quoted from the ancient scriptures, "Love thy neighbor as thyself," explains what he meant by his new and last commandment. We should, he said, love all as reflections of our very self. Thus Paramahansa Yogananda said also, "When I am gone, only love can take my place." The Bhagavad Gita describes a dialogue between Krishna and his disciple Arjuna. Thus, the other disciples are not part of the scene. The dialogue is internal and symbolizes the dialogue between the soul and God. Yet, in it, Sri Krishna describes the way to supreme wisdom and supreme love. The serene self, being one with Brahman, neither grieves nor yearns. The same to all, he attains supreme devotion to me. That sameness towards all is the manifestation of pure love, impersonal in the sense of selfless. By that love, one attains supreme love for God alone. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om. Good morning, friends. I hope you all had a lovely Christmas. I know many of us were here at the temple for a banquet, and we had a wonderful Christmas Eve candlelight service. That was very devotional. And now I'm welcoming you to the last Sunday service of the year. So it's great to see all of you. And welcome also to everyone who's joining us online. When Jesus Christ was dying on the cross, he lifted his gaze heavenward and he uttered the words, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." And Yogananda said that this was the greatest miracle of the life of Christ, that his love was so expansive, so vast, that he could forgive those who had done such harm to him. And Jesus is asking each of us to love as he loved. How can we love in this way? How can we love as Christ loves? What does this even mean? When Swami Kriyananda lived with his guru in Mount Washington in Los Angeles as a young man, he took to praying to his guru, "Master, teach me to love you as you love me. Master, teach me to love you as you love me." He repeated this prayer for several days. And then one day, the guru, Paramahansa Yogananda, was present with him. And he looked deep into his eyes and he said, "How can the little cup hold the entire ocean of love? First, you must expand the cup to the size of the ocean." In other words, to love as a master loves, we must become a master. To love as Christ loves, we must become Christ-like. This may seem like a tall order, but of course, it is the purpose of the spiritual life. It is the purpose of the life that each of us has chosen to live. Yogananda said that Jesus came into this world not to show us how great he was, but to show us what we can become. Each of us is destined to achieve the Christ consciousness. Once, Swami Kriyananda was asked to play Jesus in a tableau. And he was asked because he had a beard, and few young men in those days had beards. And so he agreed, and he played Jesus in this tableau. And the next day, Yogananda was with him, and he said, "I heard you did a really good job. They said you looked just like Christ." And Swamiji said, "Well, I'd rather be like Christ than look like Christ." And Yogananda said in a very matter-of-fact way, "That will come, that will come." And for each and every one of us also, that will come. It is the destiny for each of us that we will achieve the Christ consciousness. And in that consciousness, we will know the love that Christ knew, that Christ shared with the world. One way we can begin to express divine love, even as we have not yet achieved that ultimate divine love, one way that we can do this is to consciously attempt to channel the love of our great gurus and of Jesus Christ into this world. Saint Francis had a deep love for his guru, who was Jesus Christ. And he would always strive to channel that love to everyone he met, even to the creatures of the earth. And one day, he was walking down a road, and as he walked, he noticed that someone was walking towards him. And as they drew nearer to one another, suddenly he realized the man was a leper. And suddenly he was filled with disgust and fear, and he wanted to turn and run the other way. But then he remembered the love of Christ. And he calmed himself, and he walked towards the man, and he embraced him, he kissed him on the forehead, and he offered words of blessing. And then he continued on his way, and he walked some 30 paces or so, and he turned to look back upon the man, and no one was there. the man had disappeared completely. And suddenly Francis felt the greatest joy, the greatest love in his own heart, and he knew that the man had in fact been Christ. It was kind of a divine test, one that Francis passed with flying colors. Another day, Francis was preaching to a group of men and women, and as he preached, there was a tree behind the people he was preaching to, and it was full of starlings. And these starlings were making a great racket. They were making a lot of noise. So much noise that the people couldn't hear Francis speak. And suddenly Francis called out to the birds, "Brothers and sisters, will you not be still and listen to my sermon?" And suddenly they were all completely quiet. They seemed to be paying rapt attention to what Francis said. And so he went on to continue his sermon. And the people were amazed who were there, and they spread this all around. They told everyone they knew about what had happened. After he finished preaching, he and I think 3 of the brothers were with him, and they went walking down this path. And as they walked, they came to an open field. And in this field, there were a bunch of birds on the ground. Perhaps they were looking for their breakfast. And probably inspired by what had just happened, Francis said to the brothers, "Wait here, I'm going to preach to my brothers and sisters." And he walked out before all these birds that were on the ground, and he started preaching to them. He started telling them about God's love, about how God loved not only all the humans in the world, but every living creature. And as he was preaching, there were multitudes of birds in the trees all around the field, and they flew down and also began to listen. So there were birds all over the place, and he went on preaching. And after he finished his sermon, he carefully walked out amongst them and was just offering blessings of love to all the birds as he walked around. And they were all still. They let him walk through them. And then he came back to the front of them, and the birds extended their necks, lowered their heads, and lifted their wings. They all did this in unison. And they were bowing before the divinity that was fully awake in St. Francis. They were bowing before this divine love that was flowing through his life. Yogananda also had this power of divine love. He also could affect and uplift people around him and even wild beasts. One time, he was taking a group of the boys from his Ranchi school deep into the jungle, and they had hired a driver, a servant. They had a bullock cart, and it was being pulled by a cow. And so they went way deep into the jungle to a cabin where they were going to spend the night. And next to this cabin, there was a little shed. And so the servant unhitched the cow and tethered him in the shed and gave him some food. And they all went into the cabin to prepare their evening meal. And soon the sun went down and it was pitch black outside. It was very dark. And they started hearing a great rumbling, a great growling. And just outside the cabin, there was a Bengal tiger. And suddenly Yogananda asked the servant, "Did you close the door to the shed to protect the cow from tigers?" And the servant said he had. But Yogananda said, "No, it is open. Will you not come out with me to help me close the door?" And he kind of cowered in fear and said he would definitely not do that. And then Yogananda asked the boys, "Will any of you go out with me to close the door to the shed?" And they all were afraid also and said they wouldn't. "Very well, then I will do it." And he took a lantern and he went out and he stood between the approaching tiger and the cow. And he slowly closed the door, and the tiger kept approaching. Perhaps Yogananda had become the new prey. But when the tiger reached Yogananda, he rolled over like a little kitten and began to purr. And Yogananda patted him on the chest and offered some words of blessing. And then the tiger righted himself and marched away. If Yogananda could calm a wild beast by becoming a channel for God's love. Think of what we can do if we can channel even a little bit of that love. How much can we uplift our loved ones, our friends, our family members? This world seems to be going crazy these days. How much can we influence the whole planet by consciously trying to be a channel for God's love, to bring that love through us and to share it with the world? Another time, Yogananda was giving a talk at Radio City Hall in New York. And as he talked, he kind of started calling out some rich people in the region who were taking advantage of poor people. And one particular person he called out by name. And people were afraid for Yogananda. This person was known to be a very dangerous character, kind of a gangster-like person, and I believe this was during the Depression when there were gangsters around. And so people were afraid for him, but he was very calm. He didn't seem to be concerned. And sure enough, a couple days later, a man shows up and points a gun at him, and he says, "Why did you say those things you said about this man?" And Yogananda was calm. He said, "I said it because it was true. God doesn't like it when his rich children take advantage of his poor children." And suddenly the man who was holding the gun just started to tremble, and he dropped the gun to the floor. And he said, "What did you do to me? I came to kill you." And Yogananda said, "Pick up your gun and take it and throw it away. You won't use it anymore." And through the love that flowed through Yogananda, this man was transformed. His life was changed. He indeed threw his gun away, and he didn't use it anymore. Again, if we can learn to channel that love, we don't know really what difference we make in people's lives. We can uplift people's lives, we can make them better without us ever knowing it. The more we could channel that love to others, the more we not only help ourselves, but we help others as well. There's a story of a saint in India who was walking in the forest with a disciple. And as they walked, they came to the river Jamuna. And the saint said to his disciple, "Please hold my clothes and my prayer beads. I'm going to bathe in the river Jamuna." And so he entered the river and he was bathing. And he saw that a scorpion had fallen into the water. And he knew the scorpion was going to drown. And he felt called on to save the little creature. And so he cupped his hands together and he picked up the scorpion and he began walking towards the edge of the water. The water was shallow enough to do that. And as he walked, the scorpion stung him on the hand, and a great pain shot through his arm. He stumbled a little bit but managed to keep walking. His disciple saw all of this and he was concerned, but he held his tongue. And as the saint was walking, once again, the scorpion stung him on the hand. And this time, he really stumbled. The pain was great. It went up through his arm, into his chest, into his head. He almost fell into the water, but he managed to keep walking. And now the disciple called out, "Master, drop the scorpion. It's not worth it. Drop it." But he kept walking. And then a third time, the scorpion stung him. And this time, the pain was too much, and he fell into the water. But he managed somehow to hold one hand above the water with the scorpion in it. The disciple ran out and pulled his master to the shore, and he saw that he had a beatific smile on his face. He seemed to be filled with joy, and he let his hand rest on the ground, and the little creature scuttled away. Now, I tell this story not to suggest that any of you should start picking up scorpions or rattlesnakes. That's to be left for the greatest of saints. But the story does point out that sometimes living in the flow of divine love can be inconvenient. Sometimes we are called on to do things that we may not really want to do. What if we worked really hard all week and it's Saturday morning and we have a plan? I'm going to sit in my favorite chair with a good book, maybe with a latte and a strawberry scone, and I'm not going to get up until noon, This is what I'm going to do. I deserve this. We're thinking that way. And then all of a sudden we get called upon to help someone in need. How do we respond? Do we keep our energy expansive? Do we say yes to life? Do we say yes when we're called on by that love to respond? Or do we kind of contract into ourselves and think, it's not fair, I deserve this, I worked really hard. I remember when I was in my 20s, my father had an interesting habit. Occasionally, he would show up knocking on my apartment door. I'm not a kid anymore, I'm like 25. He would knock on my door very early, sometimes 6:30, 7 a.m., and he would say something like, I volunteered us to move so-and-so, get dressed and get ready, let's go. And maybe I had plans or whatever, but anyway, he would do this. And I recall that I never said no that I could remember. I always did it. But sometimes I was a little begrudging in my, I was a little irritated by this. And, to be fair, he should have called me ahead of time and asked me, but nonetheless, I always said yes. And I can say that every time the service itself, often this would be like an elderly person who lost their partner, a year before, and now they want to move into a smaller place. And we would help them. And always, even if I started out with not the perfect attitude, by the end of it, I would be uplifted, my consciousness would be transformed. I would have a better attitude. So the point of all this is to say, even when we're sitting in that chair with our little latte and everything, even if we can't joyfully say yes, it's still a good idea to say yes and see where it takes us. Often we'll get caught up in the vibration of all of that, of serving selflessly. In our Festival of Light, we hear these words, greater can no love be than this, from a life of infinite joy and freedom in God, willingly to embrace limitation, pain, and death for the salvation of mankind. Such ever has been the sacrifice of the great masters of the world. The greatest love we could know is the love of the great ones, of our masters, but not only our masters, of all the great avatars who come back time and time again into this world to help us to overcome all suffering and to achieve that level of love that they share with the world. And we can thank them and show our gratitude by doing the things that they ask us to do, by practicing the teachings that they give us, by meditating more deeply, serving more selflessly, by, in every moment, as much as we can, offering our little light into that great light that is fully awake in their lives. So let us walk the path that leads to that ultimate love, God's love flowing through us purely. And as we walk the path, as we grow in that love, let us not keep it for ourselves, but let us share it with all the world to make the world a better place. God bless.
Welcome to Sunday service. And welcome to the basketball team who showed up today. It's wonderful to see you all. I had been working on this particular Sunday service talk for quite a long time. And I remembered about 7 years ago, I was very struck by the teachings of the three wise men and what happened between the birth of Christ and when they arrived. And there's many, many stories, if you dive into it, that are told, and including when they arrived and all that. But I tuned in to the consciousness of the planet and what actually was happening at that time. There's a sense of, at Christmas, this very awe moment. It's very silent. It's very calm. And if you tune in to the week after, it's the same thing. It's a little bit more of a restlessness, but it is that calm sense. The skies become quite gorgeous and beautiful, and that's what I had noticed. This was about 7 years ago. And so I had been searching for the perfect story, and I think I found it. It was written in The Touch of Peace by Nayaswami Devi in 2018. I came across it just yesterday. So bear with me. The teacher is trying to memorize as fast as she can. And hopefully, when I used to tell stories at school, it would be over and over and over again. So I knew them. So I have a few notes. This was about who is the fourth wise man? She told us about there was another wise man, and he was in tune with the three wise men that were gathering to take their journey across the desert to find Jesus or to find the Christ child. And at that time, there's many stories about them being astrologers and this and that. But really, they just tuned into each other. And this fourth wise man did that. And they noticed the skies, and they were waiting for that moment. So he prepared himself. He gathered everything up, and he gathered all his belongings and sold everything. And he also attuned to these three wise men and said that they would meet in a certain place, a designated place. So when he had sold everything, he received a sapphire, a ruby, and a beautiful, pure, precious pearl. He gathered them and took them under his cloak and started off on his horse to meet the wise men. It was a very long journey, and it had taken many, many days. But as he began, his horse was really needing some water, and so he stopped at a little oasis there towards the end of his journey, and he'd heard a mumbling sound. And it was an older gentleman by the water as well, who had been very ill and very sick. And he gave the man some healing herbs and water. And miraculously, this man became full of life. And he also gave him his bread and his wine that he had had. And the man said to him, mysteriously said, "What you are looking for is not in Bethlehem, in Jerusalem, it is in Bethlehem." So the man realizes at this point that his horse is too tired to make that lengthy journey. So he decides to go to Jerusalem, where he was going to meet the three, and they hadn't waited for him. They'd written a note, and it said, "We had to go without you. So just follow our trails, follow the star," which they had seen. Did I tell you that the blue? Okay, he had in order to get that much farther, he needed to give his blue sapphire to find more camels and more food for him to make his additional journey. So instead of taking those precious gifts that he wanted to give to the Christ child, he had to surrender that blue sapphire to continue his journey. So he went on, and he was a little reluctant, not knowing what his plan wasn't happening. So he went farther in, and he made it to Jerusalem. And at that point, he'd heard, it was very quiet, but he'd heard a little murmuring of a mother and a baby in a shed. So he thought, maybe this is the child that I'm looking for, the king. And he went to the shed and realized that it was not the Christ child. At that point, there was all this, she had let him in, and there was all this mumbling going on in the city, and screaming was happening. And she said, the Christ child was here, but he has disappeared now because the Romans have come and they are killing all the children. Please help me. So she went over into the corner with her child and hid. And he opened the door, and it was a Roman soldier. And he realized at that point that he needed to protect her. So one more of his jewels went, the ruby went. He knew that he could give that ruby away, and the guard would take it. And so he again did not really know the path forward, but he knew he was looking for his king. And she turned to him and said, "You will not find the king in palaces or in grandeur. You will find the king among the poor, among the sick and the weak." He thought that was very peculiar. He hadn't given it much thought, but he went on. He gathered his things and went on. And he came to the next day. He realized that his journey was going to be long. He looked everywhere but could not find the Magi. But he decided, with many helpers along the way, that he would make his life mission feeding the hunger, to see if he could find the Christ in amongst other people. He also took his time to help the sick and help the needy. And at the very end of his life, this had gone on now for 33 years, at the very end of his life, he returned to Jerusalem. And at that time, there was a lot of commotion happening, and we know the story about Christ, and we know the story about the robbers. And the commotion at that time was that they were going to crucify Jesus, and he thought to himself, I have one jewel left, that pearl. Maybe I can take this pearl and save Jesus. So he stayed there. And in the meantime, he heard this woman crying as the guards were pulling her away from Christ. And he realized in order to save her, he had to give up that pearl. So he did. He gave up the pearl to save her. And in the meantime, there was a lot of commotion. There was the rumbling of the earth. The skies parted, there was thunder and lightning. And at that point, he is quite an old man at this point, and there was something that fell from a building and hit his head. And he fell to the ground, and the woman that he had saved came over to hold him. And at that moment, he looked at this old man, and his face was transfigured. He became all in light. And he heard, and I'm going to read this so I get it right. My Lord, I did what he asked of thee. Hunger I fed thee. Thirst I gave thee. Drink. I looked everywhere for you, my King, but I couldn't find thee. The woman looked at him, and there was a sound in the ether that they both heard. Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as have done unto me the least of my brethren, that thou hast also done unto me. So he realized in that moment that Christ was in everything and everyone that he had nourished in those 33 years. Who was this wise man? Who was this fourth wise man? This fourth wise man is us. It's us, it's our ability to reach out to others, to help others along the path. They say, Ananta used to say that the path, the journey, is only 12 inches long from the base of the spine to the spiritual eye. And how long does it take us to go on that path? We too have to nurture our spiritual life inwardly during this time, but also all year. Ramakrishna used to say, and I used to feel that this was really important because he said that the world is like water. The mind is the milk. When you pour the water and the milk together, it mixes. It's no longer anything. But if you churn your spiritual practices and your spiritual life, it becomes butter and can float on the water. Let's take these practices, get out of our homes, and try to help others this next coming year. May the blessings of Christ and the Masters bless you during this holy season.
I'd like to give you an opportunity to make an offering now.